Hello, everyone, and welcome to another Azure Roundup session. With me today, I have Peter. Peter is going to be talking about Bicep. Peter, do you want to do a quick intro of yourself?
Oh, yeah, sure. So, hey, everyone, my name is Peter, detender based out of Belgium and working as an Azure technical trainer for about 2 years now within Microsoft. But before that, was already an Azure trainer for quite a while. And in the little bit of free time that I have, I still go back to the Azure world because I just so much love it. And that's where you can find some technical books out of my hands. And I'm also a HashiCorp ambassador, which means I do like talking about Terraform, but that's not what we're going to do today.
I wish I knew more about Terraform. That's one of the ones that I don't quite know. And every time I teach, my students are always like, Terraform? And I'm like, I've seen it before and I know it's great. So that's interesting that I know that you are an ambassador. I'll have to pick your brain one day. But anyway, yes, so today you're going to talk about one of the amazing new products. I'm so excited for this is Bicep. So I'll pass it on to you and let it go.
Yeah, and the question you raised is like everybody knows Terraform and they know that it's multi-cloud and they know it's a lot easier to use than what we have with ARM templates, for example. And interesting enough, it's also why I'm super interested in not just learning about Bicep, but also talking about it. And I'm obviously a little bit like biased with like my ARM background, but that pushed me into Terraform. Well, now I'm like in between two worlds where Terraform was interesting enough, but Bicep is actually pretty cool. And I'm going to try to show you in the next 20, 25 minutes or so. And actually hoping that we don't need to use that many slides, but literally showing you in some live demos. So there's only like three topics I have. First of all, a little bit of trying to like convince you why Bicep should be the next big thing for you to look into if you're using Azure. And then obviously drilling down on why should we use it and what are the main benefits compared to like more traditional Azure Resource Manager templates or Terraform templates, or maybe some other technology that you use to deploy your Azure resources. And already jumping in some advanced use cases where the product team has been talking about Bicep for a while. I think the first time they announced it was like 6 months ago at a Ignite conference. So everybody's probably seen like how to deploy a storage account, how to create like 3 lines of code and then deploying something where I thought I'm just going to show some more advanced capabilities. And again, hoping that all my demos are still working as they should be. So let me jump in and quickly sharing like why Bicep. What's the idea? Why is there something new? So it's actually pretty easy. You've probably been using ARM templates, Azure Resource Manager templates, and you probably faced some challenges where honestly myself, you already know my interest for Terraform. The only reason I was interested in Terraform like 4 years ago is because I literally got frustrated out of ARM templates. The syntax based on JSON was so complex, you miss a comma, you miss a curly bracket, and the template is just not working anymore. anymore. Where Terraform all of a sudden is like, you watch a 5-minute video, you go like, oh my God, this is so cool. And that's really what the product team wanted to get out of you with Bicep. If you see some demos, if you just hear somebody like myself talking and demoing about Bicep, hopefully at the end of the session is like, oh my God, this is so cool. And that's really the experience I had already a couple of months ago. Now, a bit more of, I would say, a formal statement is that the product team sees Bicep for any customer, existing one or new ones, that look into an easier way of deploying Azure resources. Now, what's quite important is the keyword Azure in here. Terraform, again, why not, is a multi-cloud platform, which means you can use Terraform, but still creating different templates to deploy Azure resources, AWS resources, Google Cloud resources. It's actually the only engine they support to deploy out of infrastructure as code, at least. And even if you want against on-prem scenarios, where Bicep is an Azure-only product. Now you could use it Azure Public Cloud and Azure Stack. Never really used it myself, but since they're supporting the same footprint, ARM manager, it should be pretty okay to use it. that's mainly it. So if you have an Azure environment and you want to optimize your deployments, still relying on infrastructure as code, making your life to deploy something so much easier, then I would say from here on, stop using ARM. No, you don't really have to stop using it, but you probably should start looking into Bicep. So with that, what's probably the next question is like, yeah, but what's the main benefit? I mean, the marketing pitch, if you want, is good, but like try to convince me, right? So I came up with like a top 10 feature list, where again, the first one, and that's literally for me killing feature number one, it doesn't rely on JSON anymore. It's so much easier to use. It's like not really plain English, but it's close to like making it super convenient for anyone to use, which not only makes your deployments easier, but it's also making your documentation easier. Next to that, it's still everything, from infrastructure as code, which means that you're going to create a declarative script. You create a little template document, or could be a long document, could be a collection of documents that we now call Bicep modules. And you can combine all those and just running your deployments. So everything you might know from traditional infrastructure as code with ARM templates, Terraform, CloudFormation on AWS, all using the same concept, and Bicep is following that for the full 100%. Next to that, another really big benefit is integration with your traditional comfortable tooling. If you use Visual Studio Code, and if you're looking into Azure deployments, who's not using Visual Studio Code? I think it's like the no-brainer tool to use, where out of the ARM backend, we had some intelligence coming with extensions, and we already have extensions available for Bicep. So if you're stuck, if you don't really know what the syntax looks like, install that extension, and it's going to make your life, again, so much easier. Then next to that, the adoption is also pretty smooth. Now, I don't really have time to show you a lot about that part, but if you have ARM templates, you could now start converting them, decompiling as we call it, into Bicep language. But I got a little surprise at the end of the session, so should be good. Apart from that, there's no state files. Again, and it's not that we're trying to come up with something against Terraform, but that's really like the concept that Terraform is using, where if you rely on ARM, all the deployment history, the deployment information is stored in the Azure deployment backend, which means if you open up a resource group from like 3 days ago, 6 months ago, 2 years ago, you're still going to find the artifacts like the ARM template you used together with the input and output you used for that deployment. Where Terraform is storing that in a Terraform state file, local on the deployment machine or in a centralized storage, which means that from an Azure deployment perspective, if you go into the portal, you select deploy, it seems like nothing's happening there. Now, since Bicep is 100% relying on the Azure Resource Manager, it's still giving you that exact same experience. And then last, 100% free, 100% open source. So you don't need to expect any paid edition where we give you like a nice teaser, but then all of a sudden, if you want to start using it more professionally, more enterprise ready, that it comes with a cost. None of that in the Bicep scenario. And then automating portal actions. So if you use DevOps engine, could be Azure DevOps, could be something else. As long as you can install the Bicep tool, which takes like 100 megs or something, just install the tooling on your local machine or on your DevOps machines. And from there, you can integrate it in your pipeline tooling, similar to the traditional ARM template deployment. So that's basically it. My top 10 core features, like why should you start looking into Bicep and what are the main benefits. So let me quickly switch to a quick demo and showing you a little bit what it looks like. So I have my Visual Studio Code, and you can immediately see down here that it's telling me like, oh, there's a new interface, at least down here. Come on, more down. Or not down at all, that's fine. All the way down at my screen, I try to emphasize, but for some reason, it doesn't like it. So this is a traditional ARM template that you would use to, in this case, deploy a web app. So let me get rid of this for a second. So this is traditional ARM language where you define parameters, you define your location, this queue, and then a little bit more down, like what kind of app service plan, and eventually you end up in the resources. And if you're familiar with ARM templates, I mean, this is pretty obvious. We are deploying a storage account and we are deploying a web app. But look at the syntax. It's like 93 lines long with like a whole bunch of curly brackets. And if you remove one of them, then all of a sudden it's like, oh my God, the template is not working anymore. And I already installed that extension. And that's where it actually works. It's going to tell me like, hey, watch out, something's wrong. So that's like the experience we have up till now. From here, you would go into PowerShell and you would run like new AZ resource, and then using some tabbing to make your life easier. AZ resource group deployment pointing to your template file. And that would be the web app JSON and the resource group name, which would be bicep something. And the deployment is running or not running because it could not find that resource group. So that's where I need to like new AZ resource group and so on, but not that important for now. So that's how you would run ARM template-based PowerShell deployments. For now, if I switch to my exact same scenario, but this time using Bicep, first of all, it's like half of the code, like 40% shorter. And I'm not leaving out anything. I'm still deploying a storage account. I'm still deploying a web app and still identifying a web app service plan. So in here, I have my storage account with a unique storage account name. And I have my app service plan. We're going to deploy a B1, pretty small because we don't really need the performance, and everything else. Now, if you map the web app language, so you still have the API, that's like what is the version of the platform resource provider I want to use, because that's where the capability comes in. There's still a lot of like overlap or similarities. So again, it's not that you have to start from scratch, like maybe with Terraform, although it's a easier syntax, but not the first time, not even the first couple of weeks. And that's maybe something with ARM that makes it a bit easier. So from here, let's just make sure that it is actually unique. And we're going to add some unique numbering to it. The bicep plan and the web app, something like this, saving it. So the question is like, how do we deploy it? Well, it's actually pretty easy. We're going to use the exact same syntax as what we did before. And let's do bicep demo RG. And this time we're going to replace our JSON with base deploy .bicep. That's like the only thing we need to do. So your experience with PowerShell is already there. You've been using it for deploying Azure templates, and everything stays basically the same. And if all goes fine, this should kick off. I'm not going to wait for it, but we'll see the output of that later on.
I would assume that you would have to install the Bicep language, obviously, in order for that to work, right? Like
yeah, so that would be so step one would be indeed installing Bicep. You could go to the Microsoft website, downloading Bicep. There's a Choco package. There's a Winget package if you want to use the new Winget package manager. You could install the MSI package. That's what I did some time ago. And it's also automatically updating if you allow it to. So that also is another benefit. So while it's deploying, it is running. It's complaining because I already used probably some name or it's not accepting the name. But in the end, we have our deployment and we have the resource overview. And if we quickly check back in the Azure portal, there's some resources showing up. Way cool. So let's move on and maybe talk about some more advanced use cases. Because up till now, we have our ARM template. We're going to switch to our Bicep language. But as you could see, everything is pretty hard-coded. So what is more advanced use cases? It's where it becomes, I would say, more fun to use. For example, how we handle parameters, how we handle variables, or how to use expressions if you want to integrate like a location or unique resource name, or you're going to build up a pointer to, hey, web app service plan, I want to reuse you as a parameter for my actual web app deployment. where the web app needs a service plan, so you could link it to each other. I'll talk a little bit about the Bicep modules context, but technically it means that each and every template file you have, as long as or as short as it is, could already be used as a standalone module. You store 5 Bicep files in a directory, and technically you have 5 modules. And then you create one main Bicep file that's literally pointing to all the other files and running the deployment. And then last, conditions and loops. That's where you can build policies, but not Azure policies, but literally conditions, like what are the requirements I have to run this deployment. And loops is, for example, what I'll try to show you. I want you to deploy 5 storage accounts. I want to deploy 20 VMs. I want to deploy 3,000 web apps, you name it. And just by defining some settings in the Bicep language, you could actually make that happen. So I came up with another sample file, and I'll mainly zoom in on how to use parameters. So in a JSON file in ARM language, if you remember, the top section is the schema. Underneath, you have the parameters where all of them are coming together. Then you have all the variables, and then eventually the resources, where now you can link each and every parameter to the resource you're deploying at that moment in time. So for example, here, I'm defining a parameter called storage prefix to make my storage account a little bit more unique. I could point to the storage SKU, and these ones are getting picked up from my allowed session. So again, if you would map it with your traditional ARM language, all the capabilities are there, all the services are there, so there's no difference like, oh, I need to go back to ARM because Bicep is not supporting it. Any Azure resource that's coming out in the portal that's already there for the last 5-6 years can be touched using Bicep in meantime. But the language is, again, a lot easier. You define a allowed parameters section up here, and it knows that in the next parameter, like the standard LRS, local redundant storage, is coming from that list. The same for locations. I talked about expressions, one of the other benefits. If you look here in line 17, I create a location where I'm going to use that expression, hey, base it on the resource group location. Easy as that. Where before in the initial deployment, it was hard-coded Central US, for example. Then the other little pop-up that you see here, that little balloon, that's the Bicep extension for VS Code. So it's going to help you identifying like this is what you can use. So for example, if I move to, maybe not in my zoom in, but every now and then it's like reusing the parameters from here and showing what is allowed or what not. Like this can only be a string, stuff like that. So you probably get the point. Let's see. The other example is the references. So like my unique storage account, because each and every storage account needs to be globally unique. And what you typically see is that the name is getting based on some ID, the parameter ID from the resource group. So it's almost as easy as I want you to start from my storage prefix. That's what we defined earlier as a unique parameter for this deployment. And next to that, relying on a unique string that's like hard-coded information intelligence out of the Bicep language and pointing to the resource group. And once you have that resource group, I want you to use the ID, like the technical resource ID from that object. That's mainly the, I would say, the parameters or the variables and using those strings. From here, I could once more show you like how to deploy it. In the end, you already figure it out. It's new easy resource group deployment, pointing to the new template file, pointing to the resource group, and that's pretty much it. Another example I talked about is the conditions and loops. So what I did here is pretty similar, where up here, I create a new integer field like 5, meaning I want to deploy 5 storage accounts. And I'm going to link that object, in this case, the count 5, to a parameter. And then obviously later on in that syntax language, I can just point to that parameter. The other interesting thing back to that Bicep extension up here, it tells me like, oh, way cool. You had a parameter storage prefix, but we're not really using that anymore. So it is declared, but never using it. Technically, it could be like, just get rid of it. Now, where is that coming from? It's actually because if I go back to the previous one, I already used that parameter. And I literally, when I created my demo samples, I literally started from my template file and just adding my condition and later on adding my loop into it. Where again, 95% of the language, creating a standalone web app and storage account, and now just adding in some additional intelligence where I want to add 5 storage accounts. It's taking like 1 line of code and the intelligence is part of the scenario. So we can get rid of this, or maybe I could just flag it. And then it becomes a comment. Now you can see that all of a sudden the other ones are now starting to complain. There's nothing wrong with it. It's just defining like, oh, the parameter you define up here needs to have at least 3 characters in length and a maximum of 11 for my storage account names, for example. So that's how you could add comments, something that ARM templates are not really allowing today, although technically it is possible, but it's mainly the JSON syntax not recognizing comments. We're almost there. Last thing here on the loop. So what I did before is creating a resource called storage account, pointing to my resource provider, the exact same syntax as before, the version of the API. Everything the same as my previous demo file. For now, the only 2 things I had to add is a little bit of a loop syntax. For I, that's my storage account, in the range from 0 to that storage account parameter I defined on line number 3. For each and one of them, like 5 times, I want you to create a resource where the resource will be the unique number, hard-coded storage is the keyword, and the same unique resource group ID that I used before to still make sure that whenever I'm creating 5 resource group, 50 of them, 200 of them, that it's still having a unique name. And that's it. That's all you had to change. I could technically do the same, copy pasting for the web app, but technically we don't really have time to do so. But that's in short what it looks like. And after running the deployment, just for the sake of the demo, it was already deployed, but you can see here that it's picking up that 0 and that 1, 2 new storage accounts. Why? Because initially I tried with only 2 of them. If I would run it again, if we do have another minute, more than happy to try it out. And all other resources are still there. And that's back to that, I would say the immutable concept. All the resources that are already there, like the web app, was already deployed. I'm going to run my template again, and it's not overriding anything. Everything that's there, that's not changing, will still be there. It's the exact descriptable infrastructure as code concept that we used for the last 5-6 years already. That's basically it. In the last minute that I have, I'm going to show you 2 links in our documentation. The first one is our short link to the Bicep docs. It's our official Azure documentation and official Bicep snippet of documentation. Next to that, the second one is 8 modules in a Bicep deploy learning path, where it's literally building up what is infrastructure as code, what does it mean to run immutable deployments, to run a declarative deployment. So some of the keywords I used to just set the scene, explaining what ARM templates are looking like, and gradually moving up to sort of become, I would say, addicted to Bicep. It takes about 4 hours to go through all the modules. It's reading documentation, it's showing some videos, it's having a lot of exercises. Technically, the demos I used in this little video are all based on that Bicep deploy learn path module. I think that was about it. So if you have any questions, feel free to reach out. You can send me an email, reach out on Twitter, or send your questions to Sarah, being the host of this RoundUP series, and more than happy to help you out.
Yeah, I'll just forward those messages to you, Peter. I haven't really had the time. I really want to learn Bicep, but I haven't really had the time. So kudos on you to get on that. And yeah, I would think one of our courses coming up shortly will have like a lesson or a module on Bicep, because it is something that's going to start taking off, especially because I really can't stand the syntax in JSON. Like when you were going on about that part about, you know, you miss a line or you accidentally delete like a curly bracket and then your whole code's messed up. That's the most frustrating thing about JSON to me. But yes, thank you so much. That was a great session.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, great. I hope everybody enjoyed that. And I'm Sarah Kong, and with Peter signing off, and thank you for joining.